The Haunting of Blackwood Manor. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when Emily received the letter. The envelope, yellowed with age, was addressed to her in elegant flowing script. There was no return address. Curiosity piqued, Emily tore open the envelope and unfolded the parchment within. The letter was from her great-aunt Gertrude, whom she had never met. "Dearest Emily," it began, "it is time you learned the truth about our family. You are cordially invited to Blackwood Manor for the reading of my will. I trust you will find your way. With all my love, Gertrude Blackwood." Emily's heart raced as she read the letter. She had heard whispers of Blackwood Manor in hushed family conversations, always accompanied by dark glances and unfinished sentences. Determined to uncover the truth, she packed a bag and set out for the manor the very next day. The journey to Blackwood Manor was long and winding, taking Emily through dense forests and over crumbling bridges. As she approached the manor, a sense of unease settled over her. The once grand estate now stood in disrepair, its windows dark and empty like soulless eyes. Ivy climbed the stone walls, choking the life out of the ancient structure. Emily parked her car and walked up the gravel path to the massive wooden doors. As she reached for the door knocker, the doors creaked open on their own, revealing a grand foyer bathed in shadow. She hesitated but stepped inside, the doors closing behind her with a resounding thud. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing through the cavernous space. No answer came, only the whisper of the wind through the broken windows. Emily's footsteps echoed as she ventured further into the manor, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. "Miss Emily, I presume?" A voice, smooth and cultured, broke the silence. Emily turned to see an elderly woman standing in the doorway. She was dressed in a faded black dress, her white hair pulled back into a tight bun. Her eyes, though aged, sparkled with a sharp intelligence. "Yes, I'm Emily. You must be the housekeeper," Emily replied, extending her hand. "Indeed, I am Mrs. Hawthorne. I have served the Blackwood family for many years. Please follow me. Your room has been prepared." Mrs. Hawthorne turned and led Emily up a grand staircase, its banister worn smooth by countless hands. They walked down a long corridor, lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, until they reached a heavy wooden door. "This will be your room during your stay," Mrs. Hawthorne said, opening the door to reveal a spacious bedroom furnished with antiques. "Dinner will be served at 7. Until then, I suggest you rest. The journey to Blackwood Manor can be quite tiring." "Thank you, Mrs. Hawthorne," Emily said, stepping into the room. She placed her bag on the bed and looked around. The room was cold and musty, the air thick with the scent of old wood and forgotten memories. She walked to the window and looked out at the overgrown gardens below, wondering what secrets the manor held. Dinner was a somber affair, the dining room lit by flickering candles that cast eerie shadows on the walls. Mrs. Hawthorne served Emily a simple meal of roast chicken and potatoes, her presence both comforting and unnerving. After dinner, Mrs. Hawthorne led Emily to the library, a vast room filled with dusty books and dark wood furniture. Seated at a large mahogany desk was a man Emily assumed to be the family lawyer. He was tall and thin, with a gaunt face and piercing blue eyes. "Miss Emily, I am Mr. Caldwell, the Blackwood family attorney. Please have a seat," he said, gesturing to a leather chair opposite the desk. Emily sat down, her heart pounding in her chest. Mr. Caldwell cleared his throat and began to read from a thick legal document. "I, Gertrude Blackwood, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath Blackwood Manor and all its contents to my great-niece, Emily Blackwood, with the following stipulation. Emily must reside in the manor for 1 month before claiming her inheritance." Emily's eyes widened in surprise. A month in this decaying mansion seemed like an eternity. But before she could voice her concerns, Mr. Caldwell continued, "There is one more condition. During your stay, you must not enter the east wing of the manor. It has been sealed for your own safety." With that, Mr. Caldwell handed her the keys to the manor and left the room, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts. What could possibly be so dangerous in the East Wing? She resolved to find out. That night, Emily lay in bed, unable to sleep. The manor creaked and groaned as if settling into the night. She heard whispers on the wind, voices too faint to understand, but unsettling nonetheless. The air grew colder, and she pulled the blankets tighter around her, willing herself to sleep. A sudden knock at her door jolted her awake. Heart pounding, she got up and opened the door, but the hallway was empty. She stepped out, peering into the shadows, but saw nothing. Shivering, she closed the door and returned to bed, determined to get some rest. As she drifted off, she thought she heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway, growing fainter until they disappeared entirely. The next morning, Emily awoke to a gray, overcast sky. She dressed quickly and went downstairs, finding Mrs. Hawthorne in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. "Good morning, Mrs. Hawthorne. I was wondering if you could tell me more about the East Wing," Emily said, trying to sound casual. Mrs. Hawthorne's expression darkened. "It is best you do not concern yourself with that part of the house, Miss Emily. It has been sealed off for a reason." "But why? What happened there?" Emily pressed. "The East Wing is cursed," Mrs. Hawthorne said, her voice low. "It is said that those who enter never return. Please, heed my warning and stay away." Emily nodded, but her curiosity was now burning brighter than ever. She thanked Mrs. Hawthorne and decided to explore the manor, starting with the West Wing. The West Wing was a labyrinth of rooms and corridors, each filled with dusty antiques and forgotten relics. Emily found a library, a music room, and even a ballroom, all in various states of decay. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, but every time she turned around, there was no one there. As she explored, she came across a locked door. The key to the East Wing, she thought, excitement and fear mingling in her chest. She pulled out the set of keys Mr. Caldwell had given her and tried each one until she found the right fit. The door creaked open, revealing a dark staircase descending into the depths of the manor. Taking a deep breath, Emily stepped through the door and began her descent. The air grew colder as Emily descended the stairs, and the darkness seemed to close in around her. She reached the bottom and found herself in a long, narrow hallway lined with doors. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of her own breathing. She opened the first door and found a small, dusty room filled with old furniture covered in white sheets. The next room was similar, and the next. Each room seemed to be a forgotten relic of the past, untouched for years. As she reached the end of the hallway, she found one final door. It was heavier than the others, with intricate carvings depicting scenes of torment and suffering. Emily hesitated but turned the key and pushed the door open. The room beyond was large and circular, with a high, vaulted ceiling. In the center of the room was a stone altar, stained with what looked like dried blood. Strange symbols were carved into the walls, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. Emily's heart raced as she stepped further into the room. She felt a strange pull, as if something was calling to her. She approached the altar and saw a book lying on its surface. The cover was worn and tattered, but the title was still legible. The Blackwood Chronicles. She opened the book and began to read, her eyes widening with each page. The book detailed the dark history of the Blackwood family, their involvement in occult practices, and the terrible fate that had befallen those who dared to cross them. As Emily read, she heard a soft whispering, like the sound of many voices speaking at once. She looked around, but saw no one. The whispering grew louder, filling her mind with a cacophony of voices. She clutched the book to her chest and backed away from the altar, her fear mounting. Suddenly, the candles in the room flickered and went out, plunging her into darkness. She heard the sound of footsteps approaching, and a cold hand brushed against her arm. She screamed and ran for the door, the book still clutched in her hand. She stumbled up the stairs, the voices growing fainter as she ascended. She burst through the door and slammed it shut behind her, her heart pounding in her chest. She leaned against the door, trying to catch her breath, and looked down at the book in her hands. Back in her room, Emily pored over the book, desperate to understand what she had discovered. The Blackwood family had been cursed, their spirits trapped within the manor, unable to find peace. The East Wing, sealed off to protect the living, was the epicenter of the curse. She read about a ritual that could break the curse, but it required a willing sacrifice. Emily's blood ran cold as she realized what that meant. She would have to confront the spirits and offer herself to free them. Determined to end the nightmare, Emily gathered her courage and prepared for the ritual. She took the book and made her way to the East Wing, her steps steady and resolute. The East Wing was even more dilapidated than the rest of the manor, the air thick with the stench of mold and decay. Emily followed the instructions in the book, lighting candles and drawing the symbols as described. She stood before the altar, the cold stone pressing against her palms. "Spirits of Blackwood Manor, I call upon you," she intoned, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "I offer myself as a willing sacrifice to end your torment and free your souls." The room grew colder, and the shadows deepened. She felt a presence behind her and turned to see the ghostly figures of her ancestors, their eyes hollow and mournful. They surrounded her, their whispers filling her mind. "Free us," they pleaded, their voices echoing in her ears. "End our suffering." Emily closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "I accept my fate," she said, her voice unwavering. "Take me and be at peace." As she spoke the final words, the spirits converged on her, their cold hands grasping at her flesh. She felt a sharp pain in her chest, as if her heart were being torn from her body. She screamed, her vision blurring as darkness closed in around her. In her final moments, she saw the faces of her ancestors, their expressions changing from anguish to relief. She had done it. She had freed them. With her last breath, Emily collapsed to the floor, the book slipping from her grasp. The candles flickered and went out, leaving the room in darkness. When Mrs. Hawthorne found Emily's lifeless body the next morning, she wept. She had known the truth about the curse, but had hoped that Emily would be spared. She gathered the remains of the ritual and the book, burying them in the garden to ensure that the curse would never be resurrected. Blackwood Manor stood silent and empty, its ghosts finally at rest. The once cursed estate was now just an old, decaying house, its dark history forgotten by the world. Years later, the manor was sold to a young couple looking for a fresh start. They marveled at the beauty of the old estate, unaware of the horrors that had transpired within its walls. As they moved in, they found an old book buried in the garden, its pages filled with tales of the Blackwood family. Curiosity piqued, they began to read, unaware that some secrets are best left buried.